After her parents' divorce, Emily Bennett grew up in a dysfunctional family with her mother and her stepfather. Her stepfather often mistreated her mother, and not surprisingly, he couldn't tolerate Emily as well. From the age of 14, Emily was working odd jobs while trying to finish high school. And life was nowhere near easy, or at least normal for her. But Emily never complained to her mother because she knew none of this was her mother's fault. She was only trying to make it work, and the least Emily could do was be by her side. But it was when Emily turned 18 and finally graduated, against the will of her stepfather, her mother helped her enroll into the BII Community College and move out to start a life of her own. Emily rented a cheap room in an apartment on the rather bad side of the neighborhood, where she lived with another roommate, Lexi. Lexi was one of those kind of girls. She made her living working at a nightclub. Meanwhile, Emily landed a job as a waitress at a pizza parlor, about a 20-minute walk away from the apartment. She worked part-time there while she took 6 credits each semester at the college. Although everything had fallen into place, work at the pizza parlor wasn't as simple as it sounded. The first time she walked in for her interview, she was sure her boss, Louis, wasn't what you would call a decent man. "Are you going to be taking off from work at your time of the month?" "Excuse me? You see, if you're going to be working here, we have to get to know each other better. And if you're going to take leave every month, I need to know that as well." "No, that won't be necessary." Emily was one of 3 other waitresses who all despised Louis. There was no doubt he was a creep. He brought in undersized uniforms for them to wear and was always staring and breathing over their shoulders. Emily was disgusted by this man, but above it all, with the salary she got, she was still struggling to make ends meet and often considered quitting. It was in a couple weeks, however, that Emily landed another job at her college library. She wasn't getting paid a lot, but the environment was much better, and much of the time Emily used to complete her own studies, so it was a win-win for her. But just when things were working out for the better, a sudden pandemic spread through the nation, and not just stores and shops, but also her university and library closed for the lockdown that could be for months. Emily had started to consider dropping her job at the pizza parlor, but now in this pandemic she had no choice but to work there. How would she give her rent, pay her bills, or simply afford herself? What if she worked with Lexi? No, Emily was fed up dealing with a single creep at the parlor. And if she started working at a club, she would have to deal with hundreds of them every day. However, with the current situation being the way it was, Louis only became all the more difficult. When Emily went to work the first day of the lockdown, she realized 2 of the other waitresses had been laid off, and Louis was also planning to fire her. "Emily, I would have kept everyone, but as you can see, no one is coming to the parlor anymore, and sales have gone down. People are most probably going to start ordering deliveries now. So I was looking to hire 2 guys who can run the parlor and do the deliveries. But since you're requesting so much, you can stay, but you'll have to manage everything around here." "Okay, that's not a problem. I'll manage everything." So Emily started working full-time at the parlor, handling the register, cleaning the place, from the kitchen to the bathrooms, to vacuuming, mopping the entire parlor, taking out the trash, and not to mention going out for deliveries as well. People rarely ever came, and Emily often found herself absolutely alone in the parlor with Louis. And to make things worse, Louis followed her around and watched her. When about 2 weeks went by like this, Emily felt like giving up. She was barely getting enough to pay off her rent and her bills. Emily was in doubt how much longer she would go on like this. So, one day she called up her mother, hoping she would ask her if she could come back home for a couple months. "Mom, how is everything?" "Not good, Emily, not good. Your father's gone crazy. He's become even more aggressive. I'm just tired of constantly arguing, and now I'm stuck in quarantine with him. You're lucky you left this house before this pandemic." "Oh, what about you, sweetheart? How's everything?" "Well, college is temporarily closed, so I'm at home, but I'm fine, Mom. Don't worry about me." So there was no way she could go back home. Now what? Now, Emily truly had no choice but to live here in this rundown apartment and to work at that horrible parlor. It was a usual evening at the parlor. Emily had prepared a delivery and was about to head out. These trips were exhausting, but at least she got to spend 20 minutes out of the parlor away from Louis. Stacking up the 5 boxes, Emily went out to the parking lot to pack the motorbike. But it was as she turned around to the parking lot that she was startled by an old woman that approached her in a hurry. She had disheveled hair, she was wearing old torn clothes. She was probably homeless. "Give me a box," she said, staring at the boxes in Emily's hand. "I'm sorry, I can't do that. I have to deliver these." "Give me the box." "I'm really sorry. If I had the option, I would have given you, but my boss doesn't even give me my own salary. And if I give this to you, he's going to fire me." "Give me the box." The old woman scowled as she stretched out her hands and charged towards Emily. "No, stop! What are you doing?" But before Emily could do anything, the old woman snatched one of the boxes out of her hands and hurried off again. Emily stood there watching her in awe. Was she crazy? But now, what was she going to do? Emily quickly went back into the parlor and sneakily prepared another box and headed out again. "I hope Louis won't catch me." After that incident, Emily tried to stay on the safe side when she went out on these deliveries, and the days were just going by. Come Friday, Emily was really looking forward to the weekend. The day had gone by pretty slow, as did every other day now. But today the weather had been cold and chilly. The pizza parlor lay empty since 5 o'clock, and Emily was sure no one was going to come in this weather either. As she was randomly stacking containers on the counter, she saw Louis step out of his office wearing his jacket. "I have to leave early today, so it's going to be your responsibility to close up the parlor at 10, he said, dropping the keys on the counter. "You want me to stay here until 10? Is that a problem?" "Well, you know this isn't really a good neighborhood. There's been many robberies recently. How will I stay here alone?" Louis sighed, passing Emily a glance. "There's already been enough loss in these past months. I can't keep the parlor closed. And besides, this is why I didn't want to keep you on the job. I was going to hire a guy for this. But if you want to leave right now, I'll find someone else." "No, it's all right. I'll manage." "Good." After Louis left, Emily simply stood there behind the counter, literally listening to the clock tick in the silent parlor. She looked out into the rain. There were still 4 more hours to go till she could close up. She took out her phone and started playing games and trying to pass the time. But as the sky started to rumble and the rain started to pour even heavier, Emily looked up to spot someone standing outside the parlor soaking in the rain. All the other stores and shops on the street had closed, and it was pretty dark outside. When Emily looked closely, she realized it was the old woman from the other day. What did she want? Emily sat to the corner of the counter, out of her view, but from where she could keep an eye on the old woman. But the woman didn't move, not from her place, not a single limb of her body, and just stood there. With a sudden flash of lightning, Emily caught a glimpse of her face. She was murmuring something. Her lips were moving repeatedly. Emily tried to mouth her words, but she couldn't understand. Was she going to come in? What if she tried something crazy? There was no guarantee what these kind of people were up to. When some time went by like this, Emily picked up her phone and called up Louis to ask if she could close early. But he didn't pick up the calls. She anxiously looked up again. But now, the old woman wasn't there. Was she hiding out somewhere? Emily sat there, her eyes fixed on the road outside. But she couldn't spot the woman. She walked a bit closer down the counter, when suddenly, the lights in the parlor began to flicker. And Emily heard a noise from the kitchen. It almost sounded like someone was inside. Emily grabbed a knife and was about to go towards the kitchen door when the lights flickered off. She scrambled to get her phone. When she thought she saw something in the corner of her eye, just barely pressing her phone. With the screen light, she turned around, horrified when she saw the old woman standing there. Out of sheer reflex, Emily threw the knife at her. And suddenly, the lights flickered back on again. There was no one here. The knife was on the ground. Emily stood up frightened. Maybe she had just imagined things in the dark. But one thing was definite, it wasn't safe here. And after trying to call Louis for some time, Emily decided to close the parlor anyways and just go home. It was 7:45 when Emily turned off the lights, locked the parlor, and walked out with her umbrella. The streets were empty, and Emily hoped she wouldn't bump into that old woman again. She tightly clutched onto her umbrella and walked on. But a while later, Emily started to feel like someone was walking behind her, but every time she turned around, she found the road empty. Fortunately, Emily was able to return home safely that night. She let out a breath of relief when she lay down on her bed. Maybe this job wasn't worth it. Maybe she should just quit. The next morning, the skies were still gloomy, but the rain had cleared up. Emily arrived at the parlor like every other day, but today, Louis seemed quite upset. "Did you close up the parlor early last night?" "Yes, I did, but I'm going to quit the job. You were right. This isn't for me." As Emily left her uniform and walked out, Louis shocked, banging on the counter. This girl had just gotten lucky. If she hadn't left early the night before, Louis would have had his way with her. He had planned to take advantage of her, and after it all, he would fraud the insurance company into paying him money for the vandalism done to the parlor and a break-in. But now it seemed he would have to find someone else. Emily walked out, wondering where she was going to get another job, how she was going to pay for everything. She walked down, searching for hiring signs, when she suddenly stopped, seeing a picture and a few candles on one of the wooden posts. It was a memorial. She was confused seeing the picture of the old woman from the night before. But it said she passed away 3 days ago. Emily's heart raced, suddenly realizing perhaps what she experienced wasn't real, but surreal. Had she seen her spirit? Even after her death, this woman had sought revenge on her. Who knows what would have happened if she stayed at the parlor late last night. Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.